Jack Hamilton. Yeah, I teach in American Studies and Media Studies here at UVA, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this celebration of my friend and colleague, Njelle Hamilton's wonderful new book, Photographic Memories, Popular Music in the Contemporary Caribbean Novel. Thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks so much to Deborah McDowell and everyone else at the Carter G. Woodson Institute who helped organize this great event. I was going to introduce the speakers, and now I don't need to do that, which is great. So I thought I'd actually just begin briefly saying a few of my own thoughts and words about Njelle's book before turning things over to her to give us maybe a bit of a more behind-the-scenes look into how the book came to be, the sort of origins of the project, how it's developed, and how it's come to mean different things to her along the way. So I guess I would start by saying that I'm not a literary critic by any stretch, but I am a music historian, a music critic, and a musician. And the first thing that struck me in reading this fantastic book is that Njelle truly writes like all three of those things on top of also writing like a literary critic, which is really impressive. But in particular, I was struck by how much she writes like a musician. And by that I don't just mean that her prose flows and resonates in ways that suggests a writer who's blessed with great ears, but also that her literary criticism is deeply and inextricably informed by her own musical practice, and an abiding and intuitive respect for the musical practices of others. I think of that as something that musicians have a particular sort of respect for music as a lived act. And I sometimes feel that when people write about the role of music in certain works of literature, they tend to approach it either at the level of reference or metaphor, a sort of indication that this song must mean this thing, and therefore its appearance in this work means something equivalent. But Njelle's book is quite rare, and I would argue actually very groundbreaking in how thoroughly it considers music on its own terms, and how carefully it treats each recording discussed in its pages, not simply as literary tropes or devices, but as pieces of history and memory themselves, artifacts and indicators of a wide array of moments and contexts. And I would encourage everyone, if you go onto the Rutgers University Press website for Njelle's book, you can actually listen to a Spotify playlist that she put together, which is very cool. And of course, the book also offers fascinating observations about music's role in the creation and maintenance of memory on both personal and sort of larger cultural and national levels, and the ways that these memories can elaborate and evolve when they move to the context of the novels that she discusses. I always think that the best interdisciplinary work is much larger than the sum of its parts, and Photographic Memories is a book that draws from fields ranging from literary studies to ethnomusicology to neuroscience to history to present a really vivid and indispensable study of the roles of both music and literature in Caribbean life and memory. And with that, I think I'll turn things over to Njelle and invite her to speak a bit about the project and its various journeys and incarnations more broadly.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was beautiful. And thank you all for coming out on a Friday evening. And really great to see all of you here. A very special thanks to Deborah McDowell and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for putting this together over many, many months of planning. Thank you so much. And certainly to my panelists, three people who have been very influential in my own thinking, as both Deborah and Jack have said. My first professors, Professor Cooper taught me in undergrad, so did Professor Edwards, but he also mentored me in my early forays into graduate studies back at the University of the West Indies in Mona. And then Carter invited me to a symposium a couple years ago that kind of confirmed and affirmed the direction the project was taking, and so this book really would not exist without these three wonderful scholars, so thank you for being here. I thought rather than a formal set of remarks, I'd read the preface of the book. And some of you have already heard this, so apologies for the repetition, but I think it sort of captures the spirit of both the inspiration and the key ideas of the book. It's the final thing I wrote for the book, but in a sense it lived and grew alongside the book for some time. There was an early version of this project that grew out of a dissertation on musical fictions, as I call them. And it's someone who often incorporates music in my own fiction writing. I was interested early in my graduate career in the narrative implications of what Carter calls literary sound. But what is now chapter 3 in the book, Remembering Body and Soul, which is the first chapter I wrote for what is now the book, was bookended by 2 losses. My father passed away just as I was beginning to write this chapter, about a novel in which a daughter turns to music listening and fiction writing to make sense of the death of her musician father. And then some months later, in May 2016, after I stayed up all night researching images of 9/11 to visualize and come to terms with a poem by Kamal Brathwaite that is haunted by that tragedy, I got the message that a dear friend of mine was killed in a plane crash. So I suddenly realized that the book was not really about quirky narrative choices, but about music and memory, about how and why we turn to music and music technology to remember, as I did in the wake of those losses. And so here then is the preface, Photographic Memories. I grew up in an era of physical music media, 8-track tapes, LPs, cassettes, and CDs, and the technologies on which to play them. Most of my memories either have a soundtrack or relate to listening to music, manipulating music players, collecting music, writing music, or writing about music in some way. The subject of this book, how music encodes memories and helps us to remember, became all the more personal when my father passed away as I was writing it. An avid music collector, he and my mother ran Hamilton's Christian books and record store in Port Antonio, Jamaica, as I was growing up. Writing about musical remembering suddenly became infused with personal, nostalgic energies. My own reflective and creative practice as I grieved him made me realize how much this book constellates the various selves I have cultivated throughout my life. Music listener and collector, music fan, songwriter and singer, musical novelist, and now sound studies scholar. Looking back now, I also realized that I trained my memory on music. The Jamaica of my childhood had one television station that went off the air from midnight to 6 a.m. And since my family was rarely at home, most of our news and entertainment came from the radio. The many hours spent listening to the radio meant I developed a highly auditory memory and imagination, a gift for mimicking voices and accents, and for imagining entire visual worlds from the soundtrack offered by the radio. The repetitive music roster also meant learning songs the wrong way. Misheard lyrics, songs cut off by advertisements, or hours calling into Richie B on a weekday afternoon so he could play Tiffany's It's the Lover, Not the Love. It's the lover, not the love. So I could A, record it, and B, learn it for a school talent competition. Since my father had a turntable system at home and at our books and record store, I had the fortune of learning songs by heart because he played his 8-tracks, 45s, and LPs, Skeeter Davis, Andre Crouch, Royal Roots. So often I learned all the words, melodies, harmonies, and even the instrumentation. Once I started going to high school and had pocket money, I spent it all buying cassettes and, with my new Walkman as my constant companion, spent many hours playing my own favorite songs and albums on repeat. Do you remember that little audio on those Walkmans? You could press that and loop forever. So 3 things came back to me as I started writing down my own memories of my father after he passed away. First, owning cassettes and a Walkman, the ability to rewind a song so I could transcribe the lyrics and learn the song, coincided with my own songwriting. Second, it also coincided with my tendency to spatialize music. Because I listened to music while commuting to school, certain songs from my youth will always trigger the memory of riding in a bus or in a car. Replaying certain albums will bring back entire episodic memory sequences because I had them on repeat at a particular place in a particular moment of my youth. Tevin Campbell's Tevin, 1991, never fails to trigger the memory of a weekend in the mid-90s when we were marooned at home due to heavy rains and flooding. There is teenage me looking out my bedroom window at the floodwaters creeping up the backyard as I listened to Strawberry Letter 23. Or a young adult me walking through the city of Avignon in southern France, listening to Mariah Carey's Charm Bracelet, 2002, on repeat as I try to find City Hall. How long does it take to walk around the ramparts of Avignon? 3 Charm Bracelets. Third, I realized that my brain would replay entire albums as if it were its own Walkman or iPod, and it would do so through remarkable high fidelity. The pitch, the tempo, the grain of the singer's voice, even lyrics I hadn't learned yet, would play in my head as if I were hearing them on the stereo. Sometimes this would manifest as anticipation when actually listening to an album. In the pause between tracks, my brain would start to play the opening strains of the next. So what this reflection on my own life made clear was that lifelong habits of music listening endowed me with what I call in this book phonographic memory. My exposure to technologies of repetitive music listening means that my own brain functions like a music player. This is also true of my songwriting self, which developed in tandem with owning my own recorded music. Although I kept a songbook, I remember the lyrics and melodies of most of my early songs because I sang them over and over in those days. Not so today. I struggle to remember my newer songs, and it's unclear whether that's due to age, or writing fewer songs, or performance anxiety, or listening to music less, or listening to a wider variety of mostly digital music on shuffle rather than the same favorite albums. So writing this book allowed me to reflect on my own remembering and music listening practices. It also gave me the opportunity to listen to many old favorites and discover new ones. A key part of chapter 3, for instance, required me to replay Ella Fitzgerald's version of Body and Soul so I could learn its lyrics, melody, tonal center shifts, and when and how much to inhale in order to hold those high, long notes. Most importantly, writing this book gave me the critical language and historical context to understand the genres and idioms that were formative in my own upbringing. Finally, writing about music literally brought me back to Jamaica. The book's final words were written following a trip home in December 2017 to attend the homecoming show of reggae sensation Chronix. Already Dread and Terrible, 2014, had created a memory palace of listening to it for the first time on repeat as I sat on the bus from Boston, Massachusetts to New York City that summer en route to his free concert in Brooklyn. Now, the songs in Chronology, 2017, will forever be encoded with the memory of jamming with my sister, nephew, and brother-in-law, who chose that moment to tell his son that he played bass guitar in the song Ghetto Paradise. Good times. Photographic Memories is about how music helps us remember anterior selves, places we've been, and experiences that have marked us. Even as it focuses in particular on Caribbean music and its representation in contemporary fiction as a trigger for cultural memory, it remains attentive to the process and experience of encoding and retrieving autobiographical or episodic memory through music listening. I read these musical novels as long-playing records of Caribbean music and situate myself as a listener to the memories they record and replay. I invite you to listen along on the Spotify playlist that Jack mentioned. It's on the publisher's website, but I can also hook you up later. Thank you.
All right, I'd now like to invite each of our esteemed guest panelists to offer some of their thoughts and reflections on the book. Obviously, 2 of them have been with this project for quite some time. And yeah, just general sort of thoughts about its achievements, its contributions, really anything that strikes you. And this is where we can, I think, start to open things up a little bit more and just have a kind of free-flowing conversation. Njelle, you should feel free to respond to anything you see fit. But we can start, I guess, just going down the table. So Professor Edwards, would you like to start us off?
Okay. I was going to ask if I could defer to my
sure.
esteemed colleague, Professor. I mean,
Absolutely.
she has a record in the sense that she has taught both Njelle and me.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I started teaching when I was a child. Okay, Nadi.
Yeah.
I conceived Njelle's magisterial book in appropriate Jamaican diasporic dancehall terms. Photographic Memories is a wicked dub plate. If you don't know what a dub plate is, you haven't read the book. On page 160, Njelle defines dub plates as, quote, fragile acetate discs originally created as temporary pressings to test transcription or as exclusive cuts of new music made explicitly for sound system operators, unquote. Both meanings inform my reading of Photographic Memories. Testing transcription, Njelle's experimental dub plate contests conventional definitions of the boundaries of literary discourse. Photographic Memories is a template for a new kind of border-crossing scholarship that pays attention to the mutability of textuality itself. Deploying the neologism phonotope, Njelle, in her own words, quote, proposes a critical attention to the narration of music and music making in the Caribbean novel, unquote. She elaborates, quote, literary phonotopes include textual representations of musical interludes as well as lyric fragments, song titles, and musical allusions that interrupt or supplement the prose narrative, unquote. In the exclusive sound system sense, Photographic Memories is a megawattage dub plate that would kill any sound man at any dancehall clash anywhere in the academic world. The dub plate is an essential weapon in the armament of warring sound systems. Selectors and DJs detonate their explosive arsenal to establish dominance in the field. Reggae stroke dancehall singer Courtney Melody boastfully lists his ammunition of choice in his 1989 hit Kill a Sound Boy with Ease, produced and arranged by King Jammy. We have dub plate, we have 45, we have disco mix to kill them quick. Despite the recurring references to killing a sound boy in dancehall lyrics, violence in sound system culture is primarily symbolic. All DJs routinely engage in verbal confrontation, pitting wits and lyrics against each other as they contend in the dance for supremacy before a discriminating audience. This dancehall sound clash is not unlike the contestation between big gun academics jostling to control territory and establish themselves as a singular authority in the field. Or at the other end of the spectrum, the competition between junior scholars for tenure track jobs and eventually tenure itself. To turn from dancehall tropes to more conventional and I suppose more respectable academic discourse, I hear Photographic Memories as a resonant manifestation of Njelle's own preeminence in the intersecting fields of literary criticism, cultural theory, musicology, and neuroscience. As a literary critic myself who has been moonlighting in cultural studies, I applaud the apparent ease with which Njelle navigates between disciplines, carrying traces of meaning back and forth across analog and digital divides. But I know that this apparent ease is a product of years of careful research and inspirational teaching. And since this book is about memory, I must recall, again, Njelle's intellectual formation as a student of literature at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. She's an outstanding graduate, and we are very proud of her. We know that Brandeis University, and indeed this institution, have shaped her, but we have to big up her Jamaican roots, as well as a root stroke routes she has traveled in diaspora, if not quite in exile, to the world. I summon Usain Bolt and his own mastery in another field. In her acknowledgements, Njelle thanks me for cutting the path. She has turned that path into a multi-lane highway that she traverses back and forth with admirable skill. I am delighted to claim a role in inspiring her far-reaching intellectual forays. But I must also make a disclaimer. In 2 instances, Njelle attributes to me the insightful words of a dancehall DJ and a novelist. In the chapter Roots, Romance, Reggae on Colin Chandler's novel Waiting in Vain, Njelle reads the anti-hero Ian in this way, quote, deploying sexual brutality as a mask for his insecurity, he uses what Cooper calls a lyrical gun in an attempt to destroy Margaret, unquote. The phallic metaphor is in fact Shabba Ranks's from his hit Gun Pon Me, and I'll give you the English translation first and then the Jamaican original. When I talk about a gun, it is a lyrical gun for the people to have fun, for women to jump up and just rail and explode. Niceness is here and it can't end. The original, when we talk about gun, it is a lyrical gun that the people have fun, for girl jump up and just a rail and bomb. Niceness there and it can't done. I'm sure you'll appreciate the difference in tone and tempo. Now, lyrical is not a word that one would ordinarily use to describe a gun. Lyrical is a language of elegiac poetry, not willful extermination. Lyrical gun is a quintessential dancehall term. It's a language of subversion and subterfuge. Shabba Ranks's lyrical is the exact equivalent of metaphorical. Now, in that same chapter on Colin Chandler's novel, Njelle attributes to me the brilliant metaphor Noises in the Blood. These are actually the words of the Jamaican writer Vic Reed, whose novel Nanny Town documents the story of the Maroons who escaped enslavement. Quote, Kishi says, to be a griot, I must have no doubt when a knowledge comes to me like an echo in the bone or a noise in the blood, unquote. Reed's use of the Jamaicanism a knowledge points to the cultural relativism of knowledge as quantifiable commodity. One culture's knowledge is another's noise. Further, Vic Reed's Nanny Town, with its use of the griot as narrator, clearly tests the boundaries of the oral and the scribal, operating as it does on the edge of speech and writing. To cite Edouard Glissant, this liminal space is a central preoccupation of photographic memories. So in conclusion, in a book on memory, Njelle's generous misattributions are a delicious irony. A misattribution of memory, after all, is the ability to remember information correctly, but not the source of that information. Misattribution aside, but not Njelle's generosity, let me deploy yet again Vic Reed's tropes. Njelle Hamilton is the academic griot par excellence. Beyond a doubt, a knowledge has come to her like an echo in the bone and a noise in the blood, and she has transmitted that knowledge in a brilliant book that reverberates in our own blood and bone. Thank you.
After Prof. Cooper, I think all I need to say is ditto. But I'll go beyond saying ditto. First, I want to say that I'm thrilled to be here. I'm absolutely delighted at the fact that I can be here to celebrate Njelle's achievement. She was a wonderful student. In fact, I think one of my biggest complaints about her was that she went far beyond the call of duty sometimes in terms of her exploration of a text. She brought a depth and rigor that went beyond what was required for the 20 pages or so. And, that book was always in her, which probably explained why she went beyond. But like Jack and Carolyn, I absolutely believe that this is a brilliant book. It is an incisive study of the deployment of popular Caribbean music as tropes and sites of memory in 5 Caribbean novels. And one of the exemplary aspects of Njelle's work is that her work is comparative, in line with the kind of work done by the late scholar of the Francophone Caribbean, of Francophone Caribbean literature and culture, the late J. Michael Dash, a former colleague of ours and a former teacher of Njelle as well. And I think of Photographic Memories as being in some ways similar to Michael Dash's The Other America, which sought to read, in a sense, the articulations of a New World aesthetic across different linguistic regions. Most Caribbeanists tend to confine ourselves to Balkanized territories. We do the Anglophone Caribbean, or we do the Hispanic Caribbean, or we do the Francophone Caribbean, but we find there are very few people like a Michael Dash or a Njelle Hamilton who looks at all the different linguistic territories. So that is one aspect of her book which I think should be celebrated. We need more comparative work, not less. The meticulous excavations of the literary representations of music, memory, and the dialectic of individual and social histories of trauma, traumatized bodies and places that are simultaneously redemptive and destructive demonstrate Hamilton's superb critical skills. One of the things I found about this book is that the individual chapters on the respective authors constitute major contributions to what one would call the corpus of critical work on, say, Lawrence Scott, or Colin Channer, Daniel Maxima, and Oscar Cuelos, and Ramabai Espinay. The marvelous close readings of the respective fictions are in fact worth the price of the book. But the strength of this book goes beyond the virtuoso readings of the novelistic texts. I think its real power lies in Hamilton's articulation and rethinking of a particular Caribbean intellectual tradition that is concerned with the relationship between literature and vernacular culture. There's been this recurring concern in Caribbean literature with that dialectic of the oral and scribal and the uses and resonances of folk culture in the quest for a decolonized literary aesthetic. I think it's a kind of serendipitous time to recall, since we're talking about memory, that your book, Njelle, is published probably a little over 60 years to the date of the first study of music and West Indian fiction, Anglophone Caribbean fiction, and that's Camille Brathwaite's Jazz and the West Indian Novel, in which Brathwaite, operating within the confining and constraining context of the inherited Victorian literary colonial idioms, turned to jazz as what he says a model for a decolonized Caribbean aesthetic. And I think there is a lineage in which Hamilton's work is connected to Camille Brathwaite's Jazz and the West Indian Novel, as well as another essay by him called The African Presence in Caribbean Literature, in which he references music as, in a sense, the most exemplary instance of the continuity of African culture in the Caribbean. And I should also mention Sylvia Winter talking about a little culture and her essay, John Cunningham. And in conversation with Njelle earlier today, I told her that she reminded me of Sylvia Wynter, a younger Sylvia Wynter, and a much more accessible and lucid Sylvia Wynter. If any of you have had to read Sylvia Wynter, you'll know that she's brilliant, but you have to wade through some really dense stuff to get to that brilliance. And of course, the work of Gordon Roller, especially I think his book Calypso and Society, in which he looks at Trinidadian Calypso, and it's and the way in which it reflects, so to speak, the modalities, social and cultural modalities of Trinidadian society. And of course, our own Carolyn Cooper, whose books Noises in the Blood and Sound Clash provide, in a sense, I think, the most recent model that Njelle would have used. I also want to reference Evelyn O'Callaghan's book, Woman Version, Theoretical Approaches to West Indian Fiction by, is it Fiction by West Indian Women? I can't quite remember the subtitle, but it's Theoretical Approaches to West Indian Women's Writing. And Evelyn O'Callaghan, in Woman Version, basically uses, again, the concept of dub, the version, and Woman Version is where she addresses the attempts, or she attempts to read a feminist aesthetic in West Indian women's writing. And I think there are all these predecessors that whom Njelle has brilliantly taken on board, and she has, in a sense, extended their insights and paved her own way. This book, Photographic Memories, is an absolutely significant scholarly contribution to Caribbean literary and cultural studies. It is richly textured, theoretically and conceptually sophisticated, rigorously argued, erudite beyond belief, and undoubtedly original. She draws on a dizzying array of disciplines: literary and cultural criticism, psychology, ethnomusicology, history, sound studies, neural anatomical studies, and some disciplines which I don't know how to categorize yet. And her work, like the work of the scholars I've named, as well as people like Peter Manuel, Martin Monroe, Evan Daniel, Jocelyn Guibault, Julian Enriquez, who wrote Sonic Bodies. Her work signals the sonic turn in Caribbean studies, a turn that is paradoxically both old and new. From the late 19th century, with the work of the then folk, people were referred to as folklorists, Walter Jekyll, who was the mentor for Claude Mackay, an English man who he's depicted in Mackay's Banana Bottom. His fictional equivalent is Squire Gemster. Walter Jekyll was a folklorist who collected Jamaican folk songs and folk tales, and he was the one who actually encouraged Claude Mackay to write in Jamaican Creole rather than standard literary English. And from the late 19th century, the folk culture has become a kind of iconic rendering of Caribbean identity. And ethnomusicologists, folklorists, and cultural critics have long noted the centrality of music in Caribbean culture. And the ethnographic and cultural nationalist consensus up to the early 1990s read Caribbean literature, especially poetry and drama, in terms of the formal and aesthetic issue of how these works deployed vernacular musical idioms. Carolyn Cooper's 1993 book, Noises in the Blood, broke ground by focusing on the relation between Jamaican literature and popular culture as a radical and noisy, disruptive transaction, a phenomenological exchange grounded in race, sex, and gendered and class bodies that disturb the complacent and complicit narratives of national identity, respectability, and social order promoted by the post-colonial Jamaican elite. Photographic Memories builds on and extends Cooper's work, going into regions beyond Noises in the Blood, exploring the embodied and always remembered and memorialized and remembering affective histories of Caribbean individuals and their respective societies. I think I've run out my 5 minutes, but I just wanted to say two things in relation to placing phonographic memories within this particular Caribbean intellectual tradition. First thing, I would define phonographic memories as exemplifying what Sylvia Wynter calls a deciphering practice. Wynter defines deciphering practice as a mode of cultural critique that recognizes that symbolic and imaginative forms are not mere aesthetic devices, but the very means by which we come to understand ourselves as human, that they're actually cognitive schema and mnemonic templates that allow us to, in a sense, play and replay the scripts of what it means to be human. The second thing that I will say about this particular, about the placing of phonographic memories in this intellectual tradition, is the reiteration of sound as not merely the auditory reproduction of particular cultural idioms and practices, but sound as an ontological and epistemological mode of inquiry and construction of self. And phonographic memories uncovers the ways in which musical idioms encode, as I said before, histories of affect, and the politics and poetics of Caribbean subjectivity. I'll just end, if you will allow me, by quoting some lines from a poem by the late Jamaican poet Tony McNeill. It is a poem called For the D, and it is a poem which is dedicated to the eccentric genius, musical genius, Don Drummond, who was the lead figure in the group the Scatolites, who invented the musical form ska. Don Drummond suffered from bouts of schizophrenic depression. I won't go into the history. But he died in the mental asylum, and his work inspired several famous Jamaican poems. Jan would know Lorna Goodison's poem For the Angel Trumpet Tree, dedicated to Don Drummond. But in Tony McNeill's poem, this sense of sound as the very, as you would say, the very genome of identity appears. The poem begins, "May I discover the shape of that hurt which captured you nightly into dread city, walking through streets steep with the sufferer's beat. Teach me to walk through jukeboxes and capture that broken music whose irradiant stop is light, guide through those mournfulest journeys. Teach me to walk through jukeboxes and shadow that broken music whose irradiant stop is light. So I think this sense of sound, of music as the ontological and epistemological frame of Caribbean lives and Caribbean histories and Caribbean subjectivity has been there, and Photographic Memories is a brilliant exposition of this particular intellectual tradition. And I'm looking forward to it receiving the accolades that it deserves.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's quite an honor to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues and with Njelle, and to be able to welcome Photographic Memories into the world. It's past due in the sense that I'll pick up on a few things that Professor Edwards has just said in that sense of its past due-ness. But I also just wanted to mention that in the way these things always seem to kind of oddly happen, I just finished teaching McKay to my undergrad class and Winter to my graduate class. So the invocations are felt. Yes, definitely. So the first point that I wanted to draw attention to in terms of the necessity of having photographic memories in our hands, in our classrooms, on our shelves, is the contribution not only to Caribbean sound studies, but as Dr. Edwards was expressing, the way in which Njelle has articulated this study across national and linguistic lines, but has done so in a way that is simultaneously paying great care to the distinctiveness of those sites, of those specific sites, while also making the argument that listening across these lines can ultimately perhaps suggest ways for us to reimagine the continuities across those national and linguistic lines in the constant reformation of late 20th century Caribbean subjectivities. And that constant reformation, I think, is very crucial to one of the other methodological takeaways that sticks out for me in Njelle's approach, is thinking about movement, thinking a lot about bodies and how bodies are moving through migration, through modes of diasporic affiliation. There's a lot of attention to what Glissant, who is sort of throughout the text would call like relationality. And Njelle is really asking us to think about the relationality between music, spaces, as was mentioned earlier, memories, and bodies. To that note about the way that Glissant animates the sort of the arc of the text, I would also just draw attention to the fact that what a challenge it must have been to write this book with that methodological impetus to do so across national linguistic lines, and to contain it to 5 chapters and to rein in the specific works that you want, knowing that you're leaving people out. And I feel like what happened, and I know this must have been conscious, is that a lot of those who couldn't fit for whatever reason are there as theorists. We have Erna Broadbear opening in a kind of more of almost like a critical theoretical capacity, also as a kind of literary example, Brathwaite across. And if you haven't checked out the book, I would just draw your attention to the Lone Sun chapter, one of the places where Brathwaite reemerges, and the way that Njelle kind of weaves together these correspondences. There's so many correspondences across the text, but the correspondences between Brathwaite's more contemporary poetic ode to body and soul, famous jazz composition, the way that relates to sort of traumatic violence and loss in the wake of 9/11 when Brathwaite wrote that poem, and then thinking about how all of this coming together can allow us to, through this reading, this very delicate and detailed reading of an extremely difficult novel, lone son can have us begin to think about how to reorient ideas of Caribbean transnationalism through these interstices of music, sound, text, and memory. I would say also that I really appreciate, and this is another echo of what's been said before, and this was stunning and definitely humbling, the way that Njelle is able to simultaneously pay attention to the intricacies of technology while writing clearly as a literary critic, and then also taking us into the neurological, the scientific dimensions of memory formation and kind of sound reception, so that the project becomes this synthetic phenomenological inquiry into sound and memory, synthetic in that she's moving between these methodological registers and seamlessly, like very fluidly. I would just also make that comment in general about the book, that the writing is of a quality that really lends itself to us as readers being taken through these what might seem rather disparate points of reference. A couple other points, because I want to wrap up, because I know that we're going to have a great discussion here, and there's so much on the table already. I would just say that, to quote Njelle from early in the text, she's arguing that recorded music is both a writing technology and a mnemonic device. And so that sound writing becomes a technological appendage to human memory. And we can then think, as she asks us to, about this similarity and the kind of correspondence between the hippocampus in our brains and recording technology, and to think about how these two formats are working in relationship to sound. Another quote that I wanted to share from early in the text that goes back to the idea of the mnemonic and the relationship between music and the mnemonic, so this idea, this inquiry into memory, is that the study is allowing us to really think about the Caribbean context of consciousness formation in the way that the mnemonic is working alongside the bodily, to theorize, in her words, theorize in her words that Caribbean musical idioms are, in a sense, repositories of cultural memory. In this sense, it's a very materialist study, but it's also very, as I mentioned before, phenomenological. And I think in that spirit that the work is one of transcendence, and that on the way down here I was listening to interview, a recording of a talk of Brathwaite's from the 80s, and some of the things that he was saying in this talk, it was related to Maronage, and it made me kind of reflect back on Njelle's work and to think about this idea of the transcendence she's arguing for. And I was just thinking about the book as one which is transcending, or thinking about how in transcending, we might transcend limitations through forms of sonic vibration and reception that can provide alternatives to this longevity of the plantation imprisonment in the Caribbean, through a kind of ode and a reconnection to this spirit of Maronage and a sort of communal ethic of that spirit. Because that's another dimension of the study I really wanted to draw attention to, the way in which there are choruses, or there's exchanges and these kind of communal exchanges happening, so that culture in the Caribbean, as we are in the late 20th and the early 21st century, might be thought of in its historical, and in connection to its historical ability to move forward through constant adaptation and reinvention. I'll stop there and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you all. Those are really beautiful, but also helpful in kind of thinking about, for me, thinking about what the book needs, so writing a first monograph is sort of figuring out, figuring out practice as you do it. And a lot of the book for me was kind of after the fact, really kind of thinking about what I'd produced in a way that I kind of do as a novelist, right? Kind of thinking, kind of writing the thing and then actually reflecting. And I'm a creative writer, and so there's a lot of kind of contemplative work that went into the project. But kind of hearing some of the things that you brought out. Particularly, I think across your comments, questions about how, because of perhaps either publishing or academic aegis, the way that the Caribbean scholarship has been siloed, right? And so, kind of weird story that I began my graduate work in the French department at UE, which kind of doesn't exist. Can I say this? Okay. Yes, the modern languages department, when I went back to do my master's, kind of didn't really exist. So Professor Anthea Morrison said, go take classes, in English, and then write a thesis, right? On Francophone text. And so I took, read a class with Nadi and others. I'm like, okay, I'll just write a comparative work. And part of that, I remember the early conversations with Nadi and Professor Zengotayo, that there is really no template for, and it was just so shocking to me that there really is no template for thinking across the linguistic, there are a few templates for thinking across the linguistic silos in the Caribbean, particularly in serious literary studies, right? That there are ways in which our training, the histories of the Caribbean, the paucity of modern language programs beyond a certain level, and kind of translation work and so on. So there are ways in which logistically, right, it was very difficult to do translinguistic, trans-island work. But my undergraduate thesis was with J.M. Dash, and that was kind of part of a really, for me, that was the light bulb moment around kind of contemporary Caribbean studies, was working with J.M. Dash. And so at this moment, thinking about a master's project, it was obvious to me that I could not leave French behind to write about Anglophone text, and I could not leave my Anglophone training behind to write about Francophone text. And so it was very imperative for me to figure out a methodology and models that would think across the Caribbean in several ways. And so obviously from a creative writer perspective, I was thinking of narrative theory. Working on music really allowed me to think about, right, as you talked about, the way that music does not really obey. Music doesn't travel by planes except in suitcases. And part of written about this, right? As LPs, right, migrating with or on ships, right? But music transcends these borders. Earlier we were talking about the composition of bands like Black Uhuru and even Marley and the Wailers. We think about Bob Marley. Nadi was saying earlier about. We think about Bob Marley as the kind of the face of reggae music, and he is, right? And reggae music is Jamaican, but so many of the band members across time, right, have been from different parts of the Caribbean or from North America. So the ways that music does not really obey, right, these kind of exigencies of borders and kind of language, and so for me, the subject created its own methodology, right? Kind of to follow the music, the way way people listen to music, the way music travels, became a way of thinking and asserting, right, that there's a coherence to a project that kind of thinks across that. And so it was a challenge, and it has been a challenge all the way through. It was very frustrating, trying to limit myself to 4 or 5 texts. There's so many other examples of musical fictions, and they continue to be produced. And so, to avoid making a claim that these are necessarily representative or the only types of work that do this work, but that by looking at these particular examples, we can then talk about broader concerns, right? So that each novel has to do, because each of the chapters in the book covers one or two specific music idioms from a particular island, which is very, very difficult. It's also very false. And so there's a way in which I'm kind of, erecting a border around a Jamaican, this is a Jamaican chapter, but it really isn't, right? And so there was a way in which, so each of the chapters deals with a particular country, but there's so much that you have to leave out, even as you kind of gesture to the rich musical and textual histories, right? That kind of ground each of those texts. And so it's a challenging project. I wouldn't necessarily do it this way again. Because there's so much there's so much that's left out. But I think that part of the book for me was creating that method, beginning to test the possibilities, right, of thinking regionally about music, thinking regionally and cross-linguistically about contemporary literature, particularly since a lot of these writers who might have not encountered each other in the islands, right, would be meeting, in Miami, in diaspora, exactly, right, kind of creating new ontologies and new geographies of Caribbeanness, right, as they've migrated. So thank you all for those really, really great comments.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was wonderful. We could obviously or our panelists could, I'm sure, keep talking amongst each other, but I wanted to give everyone here, we've obviously got like a nicely full room, the chance to, if you guys have questions, comments, just thoughts, I'd like to now hopefully open up the conversation to the audience, and if you have questions or observations for Njelle or anyone else up here.
We can continue.
I actually have if I could, I have a comment or a question, and I'm going to do the horrible academic thing of a comment that hopefully will turn into a question. But it's interesting hearing you talk about the circulation thing and the kind of mobility. Something I always think of with sort of early kind of global reggae exposure is the Harder They Come soundtrack, which was, I think, actually for a lot of people, outside of Jamaica, was actually their first exposure to, because that predated Marley, and a couple of the tracks on that, I think, Sitting in Limbo and Many Rivers to Cross, it's the Muscle Shoals house band that's on those tracks, which was, of course, Aretha Franklin's backup band, a bunch of Southern guys from Alabama. So it's just sort of interesting. But I wanted to bring up, this has come up, I think, in everyone's comments so far, including your own, how massively technology features into this book, and it's really interesting. You have this really great phrase in the introduction where you talk about memory as a surrogate for recording technology, which is so interesting because thinking about the history of recording technology in the very, very early years of sound recording, people thought that sound recording was going to take over memory. Like that this was we were going to make, people thought there would be an archive of every sound ever made. And it's funny because now we're in this 21st century moment where I think particularly coming out of, as someone who's in popular music studies, the recent decades in particular, but it goes back farther than that, there's just been this really massive shift in the way popular music is both made and consumed. It's become really increasingly a sort of studio driven thing. Less of an emphasis on sort of traditional notions of live performance. And then of course our consumption of it, has moved away from physical objects to things like MP3s or streaming. And something I always think about is that Jamaican musical traditions in particular, but Caribbean traditions I think more generally, really kind of anticipated and sort of prefigured that shift, thinking about sound system culture and then also forms like dub, which is so important. And I was wondering, this book seems like it has such an important contribution to sound studies and popular music studies, which I think are still sometimes beholden to a sort of paradigm that's kind of out of date, of records and things like that. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about just sort of how, because it's clear you thought so much about media and technology and those sorts of shifting things.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And part of it is, again, like I said, kind of figuring out the methodology from the way the music works on the ground is a part of what you said, right? That sound system culture in Jamaica, for instance, goes back to 50s, 60s, right? And what's happening is you record a dub plate or record a body of tracks to be played live. And so the interaction, the tension between live and recorded, I mean, that kind of gap that you might have, in North America is not necessarily the way it works. And you think about even calypso or early calypsos were recorded at the turn of the 20th century. And so you have a simultaneous and generative live and recorded tradition, and even ways of kind of. So in chapter 5 I talk about one of the really cool things about dub is the ways that something you might think about, a record we often think about in North America as a fixed and finished product, where that is just not really the case, right? In the Caribbean, that recordings are made to be engaged with, so live in a performance, you can kind of drop out certain sounds and the audience will fill in that call and response. And so the technology, in many Caribbean cultures, right, the music technology becomes kind of one part, kind of one component in a component system, right? One component, right, in how we experience music. But even for people who have no physical access to technology, are engaged with technology, or kind of their subjectivities produced by technologies in ways that aren't necessarily visible or audible. So that's one, kind of thinking about that the language and the constructs around sound studies often derive from cultures that are very different from the Caribbean. And then the other thing too is, again, perhaps subliminally, right? I thought I was drawn to sound generally in these novels, but I realized I was drawn to technology. I just kind of kept noticing, when people were playing vinyl or playing tape cassettes. But one thing I did notice is that even and this is kind of where I end the book, that it seems really strange to me, and this is still true, I keep looking for newer examples of musical fictions, even when musical fictions from the Caribbean are written in a contemporary moment, in a digital moment, there's a lot of vinyl. So there's a kind of an early vinyl resurgence before it's kind of contemporary moment, right? So that there's something about the way we think about vinyl and talk about vinyl in regards to memory and authenticity and fidelity that was there at the very beginning of the early recording craze, and the way that we think about kind of vinyl and warmth, right? But there's a way in which the Caribbean kind of anticipated that, right? And particularly Caribbean novelists anticipated that by thinking about there's something that the vinyl record does, or we imagine it to do, and it's being constructed, right? As doing that's really kind of powerful, particularly in the face of whether depredations of memory or the kind of post-colonial trauma you're talking about, Carter, or things like migration, right? There's something we need to stave off, and holding on to a physical object, like the vinyl record, kind of helps us work through that, right? In a way that MP3 and kind of newer technologies might not.
Yeah.
Can I just add to what you were saying, just specifically about the vinyl, which I think is very reflective of Njelle's attention to this sort of materialist aspect of the study, which is when you're talking about dub. I mean, those of us who work on the music know this pretty well, but I think many people approaching the book might not. But you take great care to point out about that kind of ephemerality of the acetate dub plates, and kind of thinking about that in terms alongside how you're constructing the ideas about this relationality between memory and sound. I think it's so generative.
Thanks so much. Njelle, I haven't read your book yet, but it's very much and particularly after these comments, I just really can't wait to dive in. But I was really fascinated in hearing, I know that this is something that you've mentioned before conversation, but just hearing the fact that you've talked about neuroscience in your book. And from a music studies perspective, there's been a lot of antipathy between the cognitive versus the cultural approach. So people, as musicologists, feel that music cognition people are they universalize too much, or that it's biological determinism versus, music cognition people feel that the cultural approach is vague and woolly. And I'm really fascinated. And I mean, in my own work, I've done a lot of research on pleasure and have done research into the brain science part of that, but have never found a way to write about both of those things side by side. So I wondered if you could talk about how you managed to balance, if that was an issue for you, in having a very kind of rooted study, kind of site-specific study in a way, and then also looking at this cognitive approach.
Thank you for that, Nomi. Part of it, I think, maybe kind of goes back to Carolyn's very generous, what was the phrase, kind of, thinking about, I don't know if I would have called myself a Gregoriot, but it was, thank you. Part of that tradition, right, is kind of thinking about straddling the border. And part of the methodology I was creating for this book is figuring out what those borders were. There were many, as you heard. And I don't know if my colleague Marlene Dowds is still here, but one of the things she said when I met her, we were talking about so many of us, Caribbeanists, contemporary Caribbeanists, were not really trained as Caribbeanists or graduate programs in the US at a particular moment. Did not train Caribbeanists. You just kind of had to accidentally become or on purpose, kind of read on the side or kind of figure out your methodology on the side or your corpus on the side. And part of what she said to me was about privileging and centering Caribbean theorists, right? The Caribbean specificity, and not worrying about, not even just not worrying about, but actually just discarding some things. And so a lot of this book was just kind of turning off some channels. Again, that dove metaphor, kind of silencing some channels, and tuning in or amplifying the grounded practice, which is that in the Caribbean, that's not a question that musicians will ask, right? So I mean, you go into the booth and you construct a song and you think about, okay, I'm gonna turn up the bass here. I'm gonna do this here. You're thinking about how the audience will remember it, right? And so there's a way in which the kinds of anxieties around kind of disciplines are just not part of the conversation. So I wanted to kind of honor that and kind of draw my methodology from that. What happens if we listen to these texts the way that we listen to the music, and that for me was a really kind of a profound way of kind of understanding how they appear in the text as well, because that's what the characters were doing, right? So a lot of it for me was just kind of not even, kind of silencing some academic discourses because I had to, because people like Carolyn kind of did that. I mean, I don't know if I should talk business in public, but
go right ahead.
For instance, Carolyn pioneered this. I mean, she's one of I might not be getting the language right, but co-founder of the Reggae Studies Unit, founder of the Reggae Studies Unit, which is among the many things. Really thinking about University of West Indies in Jamaica should privilege reggae, Jamaican Creole or Jamaican language, it's now properly called, right? And so kind of thinking about a space for that. And so one of the things she does is she has a bilingual column in the Leader, which I think she just posted an hour ago.
It turned out I'm writing it while in the panel. I'm quite ashamed to say I'm on the last 50 words and it has taken me all of I got here. And I'm still writing the last 50 words after all of this panel.
It has to go in. But part of what she did with a lot of pushback, right? A lot of criticism from high and low corners of Jamaica is that reggae isn't music, patois isn't a language, right? And so to pioneer academic work that takes seriously, right, the music, the language, the grounded, the practices, right, of the culture. So that kind of gave me permission in a way, right, to kind of say, well, no, but these books are actually using neuroscience discourses. Therefore, I'm going to talk about them and take it seriously and see what we get when we do so. And I think, I hope that it's productive.
Can I just say, quoting a bit from the column for Sunday, that, I wrote a column, it's once a month that I write in Jamaican, 3 times in English, and yet people get pissed every month. So somebody wrote in response to last week's column in Jamaican, the number of people who actually read and understand this can fit in a phone booth. So what's the point, I don't even have to answer these people, Other people answer them. So somebody posted on the Cleaner's website, unlike those who express vitriol towards Dr. Cooper's treatment of our hard language, I actually appreciate her approach and can say definitively that I am among the many who would fit in the phone booth. To previous Congress. Why do we demonize our own language? Why, especially when so many others in the world are fascinated by it? And I say the answer to these questions is that some Jamaicans are suffering from a seemingly incurable disease, congenital inferiority. And that's the colonial legacy. So, that's a problem, So all of these sides of culture are devalued, and you just constantly have to be pushing and pushing and pushing against time.
Yeah, and to come back to the question of music and linguistic idioms, ironically, reggae, which was, when it emerged, reggae was regarded as a pariah, reggae is now, in a sense, seen as an exemplary musical idiom compared to dancehall. Dancehall has now become the prodigal child. And there are issues of language there as well. And this is one of the things I liked in your discussion of Colin Chandler's Waiting in Vain, where the hero, Fire, epitomizes the reggae aesthetic and idiom in the novel. And then there's his quote-unquote friend, Ian, who is a kind of anti-hero, who represents, in a sense, more of a dancehall mode. Although the paradox is that he's also excluded in many ways from that dancehall idiom. But dancehall is, in a sense, straightforward, deep trill, unlike reggae, which will use a more, intermediate form, mixed of English and Creole. So there's a whole politics of language in terms of how these different musical idioms are received, and how, in a sense, people write about them. There's a particular generation of writers, for instance, who do not engage with, say, the dancehall idiom, because they're horrified by its misogyny, its homophobia, its celebration of hypermasculine violence, and so on and so forth. But yet, there are some younger writers like Marlon James, Kai Miller, do engage with that idiom. That was just a note.
And interestingly enough, so a number of you might know his famous exchange for Claude McKay's beautiful jazz novel "Home to Harlem," was disparaged by Du Bois when it came out. So he wrote this review in Harlem. Trashed the book and said he wanted to take a bath after he read it. Right. This is how, so a lot of people have said, I've heard this across the board, across the class spectrum in response to Marlon James' work. And I'm really interested, right, again, the politics of music. So the way, if you write a jazz novel, this is celebrated now, but in the 1930s, not so much. You write a reggae novel, in some circles that might be seen, but a dance hall novel, not so much. And this is kind of even with Caribbean people, Caribbean scholars, but it's Marlon James that gets the Booker Prize, and many people were like chagrined, because now this is, the worst of the worst, right? And so that there's all these politics around, language, but also kind of the milieu that each music idiom occupies, and then who it speaks to. So what does it mean that it's a dance hall, as some people, reggae dance hall novel that gets the Booker Prize in the Caribbean after, those kind of questions around politics and music are really also really fascinating.
We're unfortunately about out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.